It's been a while since I picked up a smaller title. You know, a game from a studio with a publisher who isn't controlling the industry to some degree. Something a little smaller. Don't get me wrong, I have been playing some AAA games recently that I really, really loved. Resident Evil 9 was a recent example of a perfect game, pretty much, that I can't wait to dive back into. But overall, I am pretty jaded at the state of the industry right now. I feel like most of the time, these studios are really focused on sustained player engagement over anything, and that means draining us of everything we're worth to an unforgivable extent. So, in trying to reclaim some of the hope that I have for the industry that I really, really adore, I have been making it a mission to dive into more smaller titles every time I'm looking for something new to play. Now, I hesitate to say indie because indie is a loaded term at this point. I don't really know exactly how I would define indie, and I'm sure you all have your own opinions on what that means, but more generally, right now I'm referring to, something smaller, whether the studio is smaller, the publisher is smaller, the team is smaller, games that have an interesting idea they want to explore, something that isn't really seen in the mainstream, new mechanics, new art style, all that good stuff that you wouldn't necessarily see in a title published by a big studio. That's kind of what I'm looking for. It's a little bit hard to put into words, but I guess at the end of the day, my focus is this. Games are art, and I want to support innovation in the space by shining a light on lesser known titles that I think are doing something worthwhile. Thus, my journey began. So I browsed, and then I came across this game called the Seance of Blake Manor. It's published by Raw Fury, developed by this studio called Spooky Doorway, and I absolutely adored it. I'll just get this out of the way right now. The game is good. Very, very, very good. I know fans of the detective genre all probably have their own opinions on where this might sit in terms of the greatest detective games ever released, but personally, it was a 9 out of 10 for me just because I'm not the most experienced in detective games, and I loved it. So that means 9 out of 10, but that is not an official rating. That is an assessment purely based on emotion and vibes. Make of that what you will. And I'm not really going to get into the narrative too heavily because I feel like that's part of the magic of this game is kind of seeing it all unravel right before your eyes. But the mystery at its core is definitely engaging. I had a great time trying to figure everything out, and I think it all wraps up at the end quite nicely, especially after all the work you put in to learn everything that's happening. It's funny too because I didn't necessarily think the story or anything was something to write home about until I was a few hours past the Steam refund window deep. It was this weird battle between letting my mind wander to other places while I was playing it and, staying kind of locked in to where I could somewhat pay attention to what was happening until at a certain point it just kind of clicked and I was just like, oh, this is what that game is. This is the game. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and it's great. So once I understood what the game wanted from me and what I would get out of it in return by putting in the effort to understand it, that's the story writes itself, I think, and I was just propelled forward through the rest of the game. Yeah, it's a mystery game. I was a detective. Things weren't supposed to be crystal clear at the beginning because that's the point. It wanted me to stop and smell the roses a little bit and, take it all in as I sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together to find out what's happening at this mansion. It didn't, and I think one of the coolest things about it was it didn't necessarily leave me hanging in terms of having me learn all this stuff. It gave me the tools that I needed to figure things out on my own without leaving me in the dust. It didn't hold my hand too much, but it didn't just throw me to the wolves, and that is something and that kind of balance I think is kind of hard to strike, but it struck it pretty much on the head. Speaking to that a little bit, the first mission this game thrusted in front of me was pretty straightforward. It was a really great way to introduce the deduction mechanics at play pretty effectively, and like I said, it was really that toolkit that they handed me that I felt comfortable applying to the rest of the mysteries in the game. And that toolkit was really a system of talking to someone, getting some information from them, making deductions based off of that information, and seeing how it connected to the greater mystery at hand. Are they involved in the bigger mystery? Are they kind of a self-contained story? That's what you got. That's what you got to find out. That first mystery I had to solve didn't necessarily tell me everything about the ins and outs of the world or the ins and outs of the characters or how I was supposed to operate exactly to a T, but I think it did enough to where I was comfortable, like I said, going on my merry way and trying to figure things out as they presented themselves to me. Which brings me to my next point. I'm not necessarily the smartest guy in the world, but what this game was doing made me feel like I I kind of was, nailing things. It had me do enough of my own work on like the side so that I never felt it was spoon feeding me answers. And I felt that I was using just enough brain power to solve the case on my own. There were certain mechanics involved, like a mind map situation, or a calendar to keep track of everyone's movements, and a map system that was pretty helpful as well. So that does give you some resources to help organize your thoughts, but overall it does encourage you to solve the mysteries on your own. And I really appreciated that, because as I mentioned, that balance is pretty hard to strike, but it did so in a very, very elegant way, and I really did appreciate the game for doing that. So yeah, it was a great story with some great mechanics, and to top it off, some great characters as well. So shout out Spooky Doorway for creating a cast of unique characters that all mattered in the grand scheme of things, were diverse in their personality and background, and were interesting enough to hold my attention the entire way through. Even though I think there were like 16 or 17 different characters you had to really get to know over the course of the game. And that was one thing too. For a game with so many moving bits and pieces, so many individual personalities, so much to keep track of, I personally was a little bit overwhelmed because it just seemed like a lot. And like I said, I'm not the sharpest spoon in the shed, but that was something that I was worried would stunlock me pretty hard going into the game. But the longer I played, the more I became endeared to this cast of characters, and the more I realized that they were all pretty unique individuals as far as their personalities and their motivations. They all came to life even when they weren't being fully voiced, and I really found myself just wanting to get to know them further, not only because they related to the mystery, but because they were just fascinating individuals to have been included in this game at all. It was wonderful. It really was. And fortunately, the characters being so critical and so well written did help me kind of grasp the rest of the game pretty efficiently and pretty quickly. So it eased me along the journey, even when it did get a little bit overwhelming with all the things going on at once. I think the characters kind of kept me anchored because they just stood out as individuals. So yeah, as Detective Declan Ward, I was definitely the odd one in the group, which made it a little difficult to make a good first impression to a group of strangers all coming together to fulfill this very, very interesting purpose at the manor. But it was rewarding to get to know everyone and really getting connected to a lot of these people. Michael Scarrett, for example, one of my favorites. I thought he was in the background pretty much the entire time, didn't pay too much attention to him, but after following a lead, I started to realize there's a lot more to him than I initially gave him credit for, and suddenly he became a character I felt really endeared to by the end of the experience. And that's kind of what happens to everyone at a certain point, and I think that's fantastic. So that kind of connection that I had, not only to the mystery but to all the people involved, is what kind of drove me to see it through to the end. And I think that's Spooky Doorway and Raw Fury. I mean, they were able to come together to push out this amazing experience. So yeah, if you've played this game before, I hope you've had a similar experience, and if you haven't, then I would really urge you to give it a shot, even if it might not be your cup of tea. It's inexpensive, it's tight, it's pretty accessible, and it's just a great way to explore something new. It's not long either. It's a pretty short experience if you're really engaged with it, and it's also not pretentious as a detective game. It knows what it's doing and doesn't make you feel bad for needing a little help every now and then, which I appreciated because I definitely needed some hints. Shout out to Spooky Doorway for putting together something so great, and shout out to Raw Fury for standing behind its titles. Side note, Raw Fury did also publish Blueprints, so coincidence? As gaming becomes more expensive, I think titles like these are extremely important to pay attention to. In this industry right now, budgets are bloated, job cuts are the norm, and instability permeates every crevice of it. It's unfortunate and it's a little bit maddening. But titles like this, I think, are the lifeblood of the industry. This kind of innovation, this kind of creativity, I think that's what we really need to support in this next chapter of video games, because they really aren't afraid to do something different. They're what pushed the medium forward, and titles like these always deserve a space in the spotlight, because it just reminds people of what these games are capable of when they're not held up by big budgets or bureaucracy or profit-driven endeavors. The Seance of Blake Manor was an incredible change of pace, and I think an extremely, extremely important reminder for the fact that the things that are out there don't necessarily have to be mainstream to be quality, to be meaningful, and to be worthwhile. As these big corporations with all the money, power, and resources try to keep it all for themselves, we need to lean even deeper into supporting our favorite hobbies. I love games, and I'm sure you do too. So shout out those hidden gems. Let's lean into them.